So is the affirmation that God has changed his mind about same-sex sexual relationships parallel or similar to the theological teaching, let's say, that instruments are sinful to use in worship, as many in Churches of Christ, the Church of Christ denomination, still believe today? Hi, my name is Dr. Jordan Koss, and this is the Millennial Harbinger channel. I want to share with you this thought that I don't know, it just occurred to me, and it's probably occurred to many other people. But after writing and finishing my doctoral project at Fuller for my DMin, which included having to write kind of like a history chapter on, okay, what was it about Churches of Christ that led their pastors, their ministers, their preachers to, in some sense, to be historically bad at saving for retirement? I'd look at the history and try to find answers to that. And one of the areas I had to look at was hermeneutic, like a historical explanation. And one of those areas in the historical explanation was hermeneutics, like how members of the Churches of Christ, disciples of Christ in the 19th century, early 20th century, mid 20th century, how did they read the Bible that led them to kind of like come up with not only theological teachings, but then praxis that ultimately resulted in their ministers not faring very well in terms of retirement savings. And I wanted to share with you that section on hermeneutics because I think there is a little bit of a parallel between the highly inferential and subjective reading of Scripture that led to the top three issues in Churches of Christ in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and possibly the top issue today of this affirming trend in much of American Christianity. All right, so let me read this section. It's just a couple pages. It's going to be hopefully brief, and then make three observations. All right, so historical exploration begins like this. As the previous section revealed past and present factors for the decline in terms of membership in Churches of Christ over the past 30 years, which is very similar to much of predominantly white American denominations, similar to their decline as well. So Church of Christ have been declining for the past 30 years. I explore in this section the sociological, hermeneutical, and theological factors of the past that may be contributing to the problem of pastors' insufficient saving for retirement. Specific attention will be given to the internal controversy over the pastor system and whether to have located and salaried pastors within churches. The top three controversial issues within this early Stone-Campbell movement were missionary societies, instrumental music, and located and salaried pastors. Isn't that quite interesting? How the top three issues, again, for one of the largest, if not the largest American-born denomination, Churches of Christ, those three top issues, controversial issues in the 19th century, early 20th century, were missionary societies, instrumental music and worship, and located and salaried pastors. Like saying, no, you can't have located salaried pastors. They must be traveling evangelists. So as Ulbrich notes, preachers who work full-time for one congregation did not appear until the early decades of the 20th century, with many churches not employing them until after World War II. Okay, so let me flip forward to the hermeneutical section. So here I reference John Mark Hicks's book, Searching for the Pattern, a lot, where he himself kind of discusses this hermeneutic that he calls the blueprint hermeneutic. John Mark Hicks describes how the blueprint hermeneutic adopted by the Churches of Christ contributed to their opposition of located and salaried pastors. This populist, public, rational hermeneutic had democratic confidence in the common sense reason of the ordinary person versus professional clergy to understand Scripture. That's I think an issue still today, unfortunately. But it treats the Bible like a scientific manual or technical blueprint, which created a pattern orthodoxy. And the blueprint church therefore equated apostasy with, quote, deviating from this perfect pattern, unquote, for ecclesiastical organization and polity. In Hicks's experience, this blueprint hermeneutic manifested itself in emphasizing the priesthood of all male and female believers, but only any baptized male member of the congregation was able to participate in any part of the assembly. This included preaching since, quote, we did not see a clergy class in the New Testament. Hicks relates how this hermeneutic led to the non-institutional controversy of the mid-20th century, which included the issue of located and salaried pastors. Some believe that the exclusive pattern and blueprint for the church mined from Acts and the epistles did not allow for the full-time employment of evangelists in local churches because in the Stone-Campbell tradition, even Paul and Apollos were not considered to be examples of full-time located and salaried pastors evangelists. Rather, the local church should only support them to plant churches and evangelize, instead of, quote, serve as unofficial but paid pastors in conflict with the role of elders, where in the 19th century, Alexander Campbell's ecclesiology said elders are the pastors of the congregation and not the evangelists, or what we would normally call a pastor today. Ironically, however, Hicks's churches that he was a part of growing up and into adulthood still employed full-time pastors. They found positive authorization via their blueprint hermeneutic by means of expediency discerned through necessary inference. Interesting. Churches argued that located preachers were an expedience for fulfilling the edifying work of the local church. Others disagreed, as they believed the function of elders excluded located preachers because the located leaders are the shepherds of the church and not hired preachers. Mainstream churches within the COC, within Churches of Christ, became liberals in this regard. And non-institutional churches, the conservatives, who faithfully stuck to the blueprint hermeneutic. So if you got a located salaried pastor in the, let's say, 19th and early 20th century, you probably were considered to be a liberal, a progressive. Whereas if you didn't, then you were conservative in this tradition. A very significant American tradition in terms of American church history. Okay, so the pastor system issue is an example, Hicks says, of the complicated relationship and history between Churches of Christ and their blueprint hermeneutic. The blueprint hermeneutic created a hermeneutical crisis the denomination has experienced since the latter 20th century and has contributed to the overall crisis of the fellowship in terms of loss of membership, etc. Hicks's attempts to summarize the blueprint hermeneutic into 10 rules, he attempts to summarize it into 10 rules, yet he admits it is not comprehensive or complete. He bemoans the reality that, quote, the rules are difficult to decipher, apply, and implement as evidenced by the tradition's divisive history. Interpretation using the blueprint hermeneutic, he says, is, quote, overwhelming, quote, hard to be consistent, quote, disorienting, quote, convoluted, quote, complex, quote, mentally exhausting, quote, perpetually uncertain, quote, incoherent, quote, ambiguous, and, quote, better in theory than in practice. New paragraph. One of the primary problems of the blueprint hermeneutic is its heavy reliance on inference. Hicks states that while the goal of the method is honorable, its application is highly inferential. And when interpretation is highly inferential, there will be division, lack of consensus, and constant debate because it is prone to subjectivity. All right? In fact, almost everything in what Hicks calls step 2 of the blueprint hermeneutic, which was necessary to determine what was required, is inferential, or was inferential. Thomas Ulbricht, parallels Hicks's conclusion, stating that inference is the modus operandi of Church of Christ hermeneutics and, quote, the major means through which to determine what is authoritative. and I like this line right here. Ironically, inference both led to the located and salaried pastor problem, as well as to its resolution and acceptance in the mid to late 20th century. Okay, so something here also significant to note. It's significant to note that Alexander Campbell came to reject inferences like this, such as the anti-pastor system position, as he formed an alliance with Protestant Christianity in America later in life. Like, Churches of Christ were kind of weird in terms of this, like, don't do that. Don't have a located salaried pastor. And Alexander Campbell changed his mind. He changed his mind on this and other things later in life. Whereas when he was younger, he was like hardcore deconstructionist. Like, we need to create a new ecclesiology. We need to do away with the pastor system, because he just saw a lot of corruption in there. And maybe he did. But as I mentioned elsewhere in this project, like, his deconstruction and solutions just kind of created new problems. But it was the growing sectarianism of his own followers who radicalized his young Christian Baptist era agenda that drove him into that alliance. The anti-located and salaried pastor position was part of that radicalization that lived on in Churches of Christ despite the founders' change. History, it's fun. And the last paragraph, the primitivistic blueprint hermeneutic for many made a located and salaried pastor a conciliation to the exclusive pattern of the church. And if that was a conciliation, it raises the issue of helping with retirement. Therefore, an unfortunate side effect of Campbell's deconstruction was a lingering hermeneutic that contributed perhaps to the economic instability of its pastors, evangelists, ministers, preachers, whatever you want to call it. All right, so that was my hermeneutic section in that kind of history chapter. Okay, a couple thoughts here. Number one, the top three early issues in Disciples of Christ that eventually became Disciples, Christian Church, Churches of Christ in the early 20th century after the division in 1906, the top three early issues for them were highly inferential and subjective, based more on the hermeneutic they chose to read Scripture that was not Hebraic, totally foreign to, let's say, a first century Jew like Paul. Based more on the hermeneutic they chose to use to read Scripture than on Scripture itself. Okay? Imagine Alexander Campbell looking as he's older, as perhaps he's about to die, and he died in the 1860s. Imagine him looking at what kind of he created, or the radicalization of his teachings by those who were his followers, and imagine what he was thinking. I don't know, but part of him probably was like kind of distraught, maybe, at where people took his teachings. The anti-salaried pastor, located pastor position teaching might be one of them. But just imagine Alexander Campbell, looking back on that as a significant figure in American church history. What was in his mind as he was close to the end of his life in the mid 19th century. So the top three early issues were highly inferential, subjective, and maybe in a way, Churches of Christ serve as somewhat of a microcosm of American Christianity in the 19th and 20th centuries as well, and how they read Scripture. Perhaps one could say that. But number two, my second observation, is that sexual ethics are not like those top three issues of located and salaried pastors, instrumental music and worship, and missionary societies. Sexual ethics, one of these things is not like the other. It's an apples and oranges kind of thing. The historical orthodox sexual ethic has been around for 3,500 years, right? Since the time of Moses, Sinai, the giving of the Torah. Now, one sociologist, his name is escaping me right now, but I used a lot of him in that sociological exploration and historical exploration in the paper. But he called Churches of Christ in the 19th and 20th century the spiritual rednecks of the postbellum South, particularly in how they formed their theology based upon their sociological positioning. Like, okay, if the North likes it, we don't. If the North has it, we won't have it, and we'll call it a sin. So the North got in the division in 1906. Most of the land, most of the church buildings had more money, located in cities, used instrumental music and worship. So what they were doing was bad, and we not doing that, that's good and not a sin. But what is interesting to observe is that they didn't argue over sexual ethics. They argued over missionary societies, instrumental music, and located and salaried pastors. So, as for all of their faults, perhaps the uneducated, low socioeconomic class, farmers, you name it, for their sociological positioning, which was not very favorable in terms of perhaps reading scripture well, they were aligned with Judeo-Christian history in terms of their sexual ethics. Okay, we got to give them that. Yes, they created well-intentioned yet chaotic and perhaps somewhat harmful interpretations and readings of Scripture that caused perhaps a lot of problems that we just didn't really need to have. As they tried to solve, like I said, other problems, they created new ones. But sexual ethics wasn't one of those weird readings of Scripture that everybody else in American Christianity would look at Churches of Christ and be like, what are you guys doing? They might have handled Scripture poorly in that regard, in terms of those top three issues, as well intentioned as they were, but they did not handle it poorly in terms of sexual ethics. Okay? Okay. Third observation. The affirming position, I'd have to argue, is highly inferential and subjective. The located and salaried pastor issue, the issue of instruments in worship being a sin, the issue of missionary societies seems to me, in my mind, parallel to perhaps some, if not all, of the affirming arguments we are hearing today. Okay? This includes the I changed my mind books. I changed my mind books. One of the most recent ones is up on my shelf, The Widening of God's Mercy, right? Where they argue that God has changed his mind, that even though perhaps, let's say, yes, scripture, like in Romans 1, still says that Paul says same-sex sexual behavior is a sin, even though it does say that in scripture, Old Testament and New Testament. Now, today, though, God has changed his mind. That seems to be a huge inference, a huge subjective leap to make, based more on the hermeneutic they're choosing to apply to Scripture than anything else, based more upon that inference, based more upon that particular hermeneutic than, say, perhaps thinking Hebraically, thinking like a first century Jew, thinking like Paul, thinking like Jesus, thinking like somebody at Mount Sinai. Because isn't, at least in my mind, our job to re-enchant ourselves is to rediscover how they thought, why they thought what they thought, and then think like that, not change our thinking on something as huge as sexual ethics. So to kind of conclude this thought, it would appear that, whatever you want to call them, like progressive, liberal readings of Scripture, Christians who want to say, God changed his mind now, same-sex sexual behavior is no longer a sin, practicing lesbian, gay Christians can be Christians and be saved while living that lifestyle, are reading the Bible much like the spiritual rednecks of the postbellum South. Conservative Christians are just as prone as poorly reading Scripture as more high socioeconomic people today in Western society. And so we're still learning how to read Scripture. We're still seeking, at least in my mind, how to reenchant ourselves. So yeah, those are 3 observations that have arisen in my mind, having written this paper on how to help pastors accumulate more assets for retirement, since that has been an issue for Church of Christ pastors, as I'm sure for the pastoral vocation as a whole in American Christianity, especially for those perhaps American-born denominations that don't or didn't and still don't have let's say, a pension system. What I'm seeing that created the located and salaried pastor problem in the 19th and 20th centuries is playing itself out again today with this controversy of this affirming trend in Christianity, American Christianity and Western Christianity, that's saying it's okay, God changed his mind on same-sex sexual behavior, that it's no longer sin, and you can be a practicing lesbian, gay Christian today. I'm just seeing a correlation there and a parallel. Thanks for watching to the end. We'll see you next time. Bye.